Colossae was not a grand city. Nestled in the region of Phrygia, in Asia Minor, it had lost much of its commercial significance to neighboring cities like Laodicea and Hierapolis. But even far from the glitter of the great metropolises, a flame burned silently there, a dedicated Christian community that met in homes, shared bread, and persevered in faith in Christ. It was in this setting that Archippus lived, a name that at first glance might go unnoticed among so many others mentioned in the apostolic letters. However, his name was etched into the pages of sacred history. Archippus was part of the church that met in the house of Philemon, a respected brother in the faith, and he likely lived alongside other believers like Apphia and Onesimus. Life in Colossae was not easy for the followers of Jesus. There were growing tensions with the Roman authorities, doctrinal challenges arising from local philosophies, and of course, the internal struggles that every human being faces. Even so, the church remained steadfast. Ordinary men and women became spiritual pillars in the midst of adversity, and Archippus was among them. Not much is known about his family origins, his age, or his appearance. But one can imagine a dedicated young man, perhaps the son of one of the leaders, with a heart inclined towards service. He witnessed the moments of communion, the whispered hymns in secret meetings, and the fervent prayers offered in low voices so as not to draw attention. Archippus was there observing, learning, being molded. The presence of the church in Colossae was also strengthened by the letters that came from afar. Paul, though physically absent, made himself present through his words. And it was because of these letters that Archippus had his name immortalized. Something about him drew attention. Something in his posture, his potential, his calling. In the simplicity of that city forgotten by the great maps of the empire, God was writing stories that would never be erased. And Archippus was part of that plan. Perhaps he was not yet fully aware of the mission he carried, but he was already involved in the environment God used to prepare his chosen ones. While the church gathered in silence, away from public eyes, something greater was being forged. And in the heart of Archippus, the initial breath of a ministry began to pulse, however timidly. It was the beginning of a journey that later on would demand courage, decision, and steadfastness. Before we continue, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This simple gesture makes a huge difference and helps us bring these stories to more people. Archippus grew up surrounded by examples of faith. The meetings he witnessed in Philemon's house were not just religious gatherings. They were moments of true communion, where hearts were opened, burdens were shared, and the presence of God was felt in a living way. It was in this environment that his heart began to be shaped for something greater than he could comprehend in his youth. There was no grand revelation, no voice from heaven, or extraordinary sign. Archippus's calling was born slowly, in the intimacy of relationships and the simplicity of service. Perhaps he started by helping with the tasks of the meeting, listening intently to the words of the elders, learning to serve without expecting recognition. And it was in this quiet service that purpose began to take shape within him. Living alongside Philemon certainly had a great influence. Philemon was a man of practical faith, known for his love and generosity. Beside him, Archippus observed how faith manifested in actions, even in the face of pressures and difficulties. Philemon's faith was not just spoken, it was lived, and this left deep marks on the young man's mind. Another figure who may have profoundly impacted his formation was Onesimus, a slave who fled, found Paul, was converted, and was sent back with a powerful letter in his hands. Archippus saw firsthand reconciliation, forgiveness, and restoration happening within the very house where they gathered. All of this moved his heart. It was impossible to ignore how present God was in the midst of human weaknesses. Archippus's calling grew as he grew spiritually. It was not something imposed, but something awakened. One day, perhaps while praying with the brothers or meditating in silence, he realized he could no longer ignore what he felt, an inner impulse pushing him toward ministry, toward responsibility, toward intentional service. He understood that he had received something from the Lord, something that needed to be cultivated, developed, and one day fulfilled. This awakening, however, did not come without doubts. He was still young, surrounded by more experienced and wiser men. There were unanswered questions, unspoken insecurities, unconfessed fears. But one thing was certain: God had sown something in his heart, and that calling, born in intimacy with the community and the Lord, was now beginning to mature. As the years passed, the environment that once inspired Archippus also became a field of trials. The fervor of his first experiences began to be challenged by the weight of responsibilities. The flame that had once driven him with clarity now burned more subtly. The ministry he had accepted, still in its growth, demanded more than he had imagined. It was time to act, but his heart, at times, hesitated. The reality around him grew harsher. Threats against Christians became more frequent, and many brothers faced imprisonment, loss, and even death. Pure gospel doctrine was constantly challenged by deceptive ideas infiltrating the churches. In the midst of all this, Archippus found himself at a crossroads: to stand firm in his vocation or to retreat into a safety zone. Perhaps it began with small silences, a word he felt he should have said but didn't, a meeting he could have led but preferred to observe. Little by little, his boldness was smothered by doubts. The young man who had once been sensitive to the voice of God now carried an internal conflict: how to fulfill the calling when the heart is consumed by insecurities. It wasn't a complete abandonment, but a subtle drifting away. He still attended the meetings, he still prayed, he still believed, but something was different. That conviction that used to drive him seemed less firm. The risk was not just leaving the ministry, but allowing fear and stagnation to become the silent companions of his journey. It is possible that Archippus did not share what was happening inside him with anyone. To others, he might have still looked like a promising young man, someone reliable and called, but inside, the struggles were growing. The ministry, which had once been a source of joy, now weighed like a burden difficult to carry alone. Even so, God had not forgotten him. The restlessness he felt was, in itself, a sign that the Lord was still calling him back to the center of his mission. As time passed, the need for a clear intervention became more urgent. Archippus was on the verge of a decisive point, and God, as he always does with his servants, was preparing a precise word to wake him up. In Rome, far from the small city of Colossae, Paul faced his days under house arrest. His age was advancing, his physical limitations were increasing, but his spirit remained steadfast. Even in chains, he continued to exercise his ministry with authority and zeal. Through letters, he pastored churches, exhorted brothers, and kept the flame of the gospel alive. It was in this context that Paul wrote a brief but profound letter addressed to Philemon. The main message concerned the reconciliation between Philemon and his slave Onesimus, now a convert. However, among the names mentioned with affection and honor, the name of Archippus also appeared. Paul called him our fellow soldier. This expression carried special weight. It was as if Paul was saying, "Archippus, you are on the front lines with me." Even though physically distant, the apostle saw in Archippus not just a young man with potential, but a warrior in the same spiritual battlefield. It was a public affirmation, read aloud before the gathered church, reminding everyone, and especially Archippus, that he was not forgotten. Paul could have addressed many others. There were leaders in various cities, experienced men, apostles in full activity, but choosing to mention Archippus revealed something. The apostle discerned the need for encouragement, perhaps even correction. It was a subtle but powerful way to rekindle the sense of responsibility in the young man's heart. For Archippus, hearing his name in the reading of the letter must have provoked a mix of emotions. There was honor, no doubt. To be recognized by Paul was no small thing, but there was also an implicit call to vigilance. Paul was not just praising him, he was reminding him of the place he occupied in the mission of the kingdom. It was like a firm hand on the shoulder saying, "You are still a part of this." This brief mention, though simple to those who merely read the text, was likely a turning point in Archippus's life. It arrived at a moment when he needed to be reminded of who he was, where he came from, and what he was called for. Paul, even from miles away, saw into the young man's heart. Time passed, and another letter from Paul arrived at the church in Colossae. This time, it was a longer epistle, addressed to the entire community. In it, the apostle dealt with deep themes: the supremacy of Christ, steadfastness in faith, the dangers of deceptive doctrines, and the importance of a transformed life. It was a rich, pastoral, and theological letter, but at the end, among the greetings and recommendations, a name appeared once more, with a more direct, more urgent tone. "Tell Archippus, see to it that you complete the ministry you have received in the Lord." These words were read before the congregation. They were not hidden in a private message. Paul, inspired by the Spirit, made sure they were heard by everyone. It was as if the apostle were saying, "Archippus, you need to wake up. Your calling cannot stay dormant." The exhortation was clear, almost like an alarm. It was no longer just about reminding the young man of his place in the battle, as in the letter to Philemon. Now, it was a call to responsibility. Archippus had received a ministry from the Lord, something entrusted by God directly to him, and it was necessary for him to fulfill it. The tone of the warning reveals the seriousness of the moment. Perhaps Archippus was at a breaking point. The flame had not gone out, but it was weakening. The enthusiasm of old was threatened by the weight of doubt, the fear of persecution, or perhaps the simple exhaustion of someone who no longer saw immediate fruit in his service. Paul's words did not come to accuse, but to awaken. They were like the sound of a trumpet calling back the soldier who had strayed from the front line. A reminder that the calling was not human. It did not come from the expectations of others. It came from the Lord, and for that reason it deserved to be carried through to the end. For Archippus, hearing this before the whole church was undoubtedly impactful, but it was also liberating. It was confirmation that God still counted on him, that his story was not over, that there was still time to stand up and follow in obedience. The warning was clear, yet full of grace. It was time to make a decision, to ignore the voice of God or to start walking firmly again toward the purpose entrusted to him. After reading Paul's letter, Archippus could no longer ignore what he felt. The words echoed in his mind with intensity. "See to it that you complete the ministry." It was as if every syllable weighed on his shoulders, but the reality around him remained challenging, and the simple desire to obey was not enough to quiet the internal and external noise surrounding him. Distractions came not only from without, but also from within. There were days when the weight of others' expectations felt crushing. Other times, it was the comparison with more experienced brothers that paralyzed him. In moments of fragility, even the silence of God felt like a barrier. Archippus began to question if he was truly called, if he had anything to offer, or if he was just trying to fit into something that wasn't for him. Around him, the city of Colossae also offered dangerous distractions. Philosophical teachings tried to mix human wisdom with the truth of the gospel. Voices within the community itself questioned the foundations of the faith. There was confusion, and many believers were being swept away by winds of doctrine. Archippus, who had once been firm, now found himself wavering, not because he wanted to stray, but because he could no longer discern the path clearly. The pressure to please, the fear of failure, and silent exhaustion began to erode his resolve. The ministry, once a source of joy, had become unstable ground where every step felt too risky. He still loved the Lord, he still attended the meetings, he still prayed, but his soul was tired, and zeal gave way to apathy. The danger of drifting does not always present itself as open rebellion. Sometimes it comes disguised as conformism, inertia, or silence. Archippus stood before this abyss. He had not abandoned the faith, but he ran the risk of living without passion, of serving without purpose, of remaining without bearing fruit. And yet there was something that prevented him from giving up completely. Paul's words remained alive in his mind. The Holy Spirit, even in the midst of exhaustion, still whispered to his conscience. It was like an ember hidden under the ashes. It seemed extinguished, but a single breath was enough to reignite it. There was a time when Archippus felt safe just by obeying. It was enough to hear, feel, and follow. But now, with a divided heart and the weight of the ministry more evident, he saw himself in an invisible battlefield, not against external enemies, but against his own thoughts, emotions, and uncertainties. The calling that once drove him now seemed to demand more than he thought he was capable of giving. Doubts became constant companions. What if I fail? What if I'm not enough? What if all this is more than I can bear? These questions haunted him in the silent early hours and in moments of solitude. He did not deny the calling, but he did not know how to proceed. He was caught between the fear of failing and the deep desire to obey. Every day was a renewed tension. On one side, the living memory of Paul's words, "See to it that you complete the ministry." On the other, the silent insecurity that made him hesitate. Archippus began to understand that the greatest obstacle was not the external environment, nor even persecution. It was the fear that lived inside him, trying to convince him that he was not worthy, nor prepared, nor enough. But in that place of struggle, God was also present, not with noise or demands, but with patience. The memory of the meetings, the answered prayers, the lives transformed in his own community, all these served as small sparks, reigniting his faith. Archippus realized that he had not been called by men, and that the ministry he carried was not the result of a personal choice. It was a gift, a mission given by the Lord himself. Little by little, he began to turn his eyes back to the true foundation. It was not his abilities that would sustain him, but the faithfulness of God. Fear still existed, but it no longer spoke as loudly. The desire to obey began to grow again, like a buried seed that resists the cold, and at the right time breaks through the earth to flourish. The confrontation was not over, but something inside Archippus was beginning to steady. He understood that continuing did not mean an absence of fear, it meant following despite it. And that step, though still timid, was already a sign that his heart was realigning with its original purpose. There came a moment when silence became the answer. Archippus, after so many internal conflicts, allowed himself to be still, not to run away, but to listen. The rush of thoughts gave way to a sincere search for direction. And in that secret place of the soul, where only God sees, something began to change. It was not a visible miracle nor a sudden shift. It was a subtle but firm repositioning. He understood that ministry did not depend on constant emotions or absolute certainties. It was a walk of faith, often silent but deeply rooted in obedience. Archippus no longer waited to feel courageous to proceed. He chose to follow, even with fears still present. And that decision marked the beginning of his restoration. The community noticed the difference. There was a new serenity in Archippus. His words, once retracted, now carried clarity. His steps, once hesitant, showed firmness. He returned to serving with purpose, no longer seeking to please or prove anything, but simply responding to the calling the Lord had entrusted to him from the beginning. The ministry now was no longer a heavy burden, but a reverent privilege. Archippus took back his place, not with pomp, but with humility. He knew it was not by his strength, but by grace. Every teaching shared, every act of service, every moment with the brothers was lived as an opportunity to glorify God and not himself. Paul's words, once heard as a warning, were now remembered as a milestone of renewal. See to it that you complete the ministry you have received in the Lord. Archippus no longer wanted to just be present, he wanted to fulfill it, to the very end. And that determination, silent and sincere, led him to a new season of spiritual maturity. He understood that the focus was not on himself, but on Christ. and that the mission, however challenging it might be, was sustained by the one who had called him. His story ceased to be marked by doubt and began to be marked by faithfulness. Renewal did not come as a response to personal merit, but as the fruit of the grace that insists on restoring weary hearts. Archippus had returned, not as the same insecure young man, but as a servant who had learned, through pain and surrender, the true value of an obedient ministry. Throughout the years, many names have risen and disappeared in the history of the early church. Apostles, teachers, evangelists, each with their journey, their deeds, their struggles. Some were recorded for great works, others for impressive miracles. But Archippus remained in the scriptures for a unique reason. He was remembered because he almost lost his calling, and he was warned in time. His name is not linked to extraordinary healings or powerful speeches. He did not write letters, nor did he found famous churches, but he was mentioned twice with purpose, and in those few words there is an eternal weight. Paul saw through the Spirit that Archippus was at risk, and he did not ignore it. With pastoral love and divine zeal, he recorded the warning, "Complete the ministry you received in the Lord." What could have been a story of being forgotten became a testimony of restoration. Archippus represents so many who, like him, walk between the fervor of the beginning and the danger of stagnation, who know the calling but face the shadows of weariness, distractions, and comparisons. His trajectory reminds us that the simple fact of being remembered and warned by God is, in itself, a demonstration of care and mercy. We do not know the exact end of his life. We do not have details about the direct fruits of his ministry. But we know that his response to the warning put him back on the right path. And that response is what God seeks most. Hearts that listen, that surrender, that align once again. Archippus's name was engraved in the Bible, not as a fearless hero, but as a real human man who almost drifted away and who was reached in time. A living reminder that God does not give up on his own, even when they falter. In churches, in every generation, there are other Archippuses, men and women who started well, but who today feel distant, overwhelmed, or confused. And the message remains, see to it, fulfill. Not out of obligation, but because there is a ministry, a mission, something precious entrusted by the Lord himself. Archippus teaches us that it is never too late to start over, that God speaks, that God waits, and that even in the background of history, he is attentive to the steps of every servant. The story of Archippus is not told in long chapters, but in a few lines that cross the centuries with surprising force. What could have been just a discreet citation is transformed into a mirror for all those who, at some point in the journey, felt the weight of discouragement, the pain of being forgotten, or confusion about their purpose. Archippus represents those who were called but found themselves weakened by routine, doubt, or pressure. Those who started with fervor but, over time, were being suffocated by internal and external voices. And that is precisely why his story is so precious, because it shows us that God does not ignore those who are about to give up. He speaks, calls, awakens, and restores. Paul's warning remains alive. See to it that you complete the ministry you have received in the Lord. This sentence, even today, arises as an invitation to vigilance, but also as a reminder that the calling does not come from men, nor does it depend on our performance. It is received from the Lord, and if it is He who calls, it is He who also enables. The Christian life is not made only of inspiring beginnings, but of faithful endurance. Archippus teaches us that starting over is part of the journey, that hearing a word of correction can be the beginning of a new phase, that God does not choose only the strong, He strengthens the chosen. For those who have thought about stopping, for those who feel the fire has gone out, Archippus's story is a breath of hope. God did not expose him, He reminded him. He did not reject him, He revived him. He did not replace him. He restored him, and he continues to do the same for every weary servant, every wavering heart, every soul that desires to once again fulfill what they once received. Archippus's ministry may have been discreet, but it was real, and that is exactly what makes him so close to us, because in his weakness, we find strength. In his doubt, we find direction. In his return, we find hope. Now share in the comments, what part of this message impacted you the most? Also, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and send this video to someone who needs this encouragement.